A millionaire paid a homeless woman to have his baby, but what she did after birth left him in tears. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Enjoy the story. The air was cold and biting, the kind of chill that seeped through even the thickest layers and settled deep in the bones. Charlotte pulled her thin jacket tighter around her body, though it did little to protect her from the autumn wind slicing through the city streets. She sat on the corner of 5th and Main, leaning against the brick wall of an old convenience store, her knees drawn up to her chest. The pavement beneath her was damp, and the faint smell of rain lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of the city. People walked by in hurried strides, their faces hidden behind scarves and collars, their gazes fixed on the ground or the glowing screens in their hands. Not one of them looked her way. She had long since grown used to being invisible, just another shadow in the city's endless stream of life. Her fingers, numb from the cold, tightened around the strap of her bag. It was all she had left, a tattered relic of the life she'd lost. The sound of approaching footsteps broke through her thoughts. At first, she didn't look up. Footsteps meant nothing. People passed her every day without so much as a glance. But these were different. They weren't hurried or indifferent. They were steady, purposeful, and coming directly toward her. "Miss," a voice said, low and firm, but not unkind. Charlotte's head snapped up. Standing a few feet away was a man, his figure backlit by the soft glow of a nearby street lamp. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his black wool coat perfectly tailored to his frame. Everything about him screamed wealth and authority, from the polished leather shoes to the way he carried himself, as if the world itself bent to his will. "Can I help you?" she asked warily, her voice sharp and defensive. Men like him didn't stop for people like her. She wasn't in the mood to play along with whatever game he thought he was starting. The man didn't flinch at her tone. Instead, he took a careful step closer, his hands resting in the pockets of his coat. "I'd like to speak with you," he said evenly. Charlotte narrowed her eyes, her grip tightening on her bag. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." He gave a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his piercing blue eyes. "I'm not selling anything. I'm here to offer an opportunity." Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "Oh, I've heard that one before. Opportunity. That's a new word for it." "You're skeptical," he observed, nodding slightly. "I don't blame you. If I were in your position, I'd feel the same." "Then why are you bothering me?" she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "Go find someone else to save." "I'm not here to save you," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "I'm here to propose a business arrangement, one that could benefit us both." Charlotte blinked, caught off guard by his choice of words. "A business arrangement," she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "What kind of business involves someone like me?" The man hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "My name is Matthew Grayson," he began. "I've built a life most people dream of, but there's one thing I don't have: an heir." Charlotte stared at him, her confusion only deepening. "What does that have to do with me?" "I need someone to carry my child," Matthew said bluntly. "In return, you'll receive financial security, a safe place to live, and the best medical care available. Everything you need to rebuild your life." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, heavy and impossible to ignore. Charlotte's mouth opened, then closed, her mind scrambling to process what he had just said. "You're joking," she finally managed, though her voice wavered. "I'm not," Matthew said, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't scam or a trick. It's an opportunity for both of us." Charlotte laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You've got to be out of your mind. Do you even hear yourself? You don't just walk up to strangers on the street and ask them to have your kid." "I don't," Matthew admitted, his tone softening slightly. "But I've spent months looking for the right person, someone who would benefit from this arrangement as much as I would. And when I saw you, I knew you were the one." His words sent a chill down her spine, though she wasn't sure if it was from fear or something else. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're strong. I know you've survived things most people couldn't. And I know you deserve a chance to start over." Charlotte shook her head, her hands trembling as she pushed herself to her feet. "You're insane," she muttered, taking a step back. "And I'm not interested." Matthew didn't move to stop her. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card, placing it gently on the crate she had been sitting on. "If you change your mind," he said, his voice calm and measured, "you'll know where to find me." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the sea of pedestrians. Charlotte stood frozen, her gaze locked on the card. It gleamed under the streetlight, the bold white letters spelling out his name and the address of a place she could hardly imagine stepping into. For a long time, she didn't move. The city continued to swirl around her, indifferent to the life-altering choice now sitting at her feet. Finally, with trembling hands, she picked up the card, her mind racing with possibilities she couldn't yet bring herself to believe. The card sat on the crate for days, its pristine black surface almost mocking Charlotte every time she glanced at it. She told herself she wouldn't pick it up, wouldn't even entertain the idea. And yet, she couldn't stop thinking about Matthew Grayson's words. They echoed in her mind during the long, cold nights, their weight growing heavier with each passing day. An opportunity for both of us. The idea was absurd. Who just walks up to a stranger on the street with such an outrageous proposal? And yet, something about the way he had spoken, the calmness in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, it didn't feel like a scam. At least, not the kind she was used to. By the third day, she gave in. Picking up the card, she turned it over in her fingers, the address gleaming under the faint glow of a street lamp. It was in a part of the city she'd never been to, a place she only knew from glimpses on TV and magazine covers. Wealthy, untouchable, and entirely out of her league. "This is crazy," she muttered to herself, slipping the card into her pocket. "But what do I have to lose?" The bus ride to the address was nerve-wracking. Charlotte sat in the back, clutching her bag like a lifeline, her mind racing with doubts and worst-case scenarios. What if it was a trap? What if he wasn't who he claimed to be? She heard stories about people disappearing, about women lured into dangerous situations with promises of a better life. But then she thought about the streets, the cold, the hunger. The risk felt worth it. When the bus finally pulled up to the stop near the towering glass building, her breath caught in her throat. The structure was impossibly sleek, its reflective surface shimmering under the midday sun. People in tailored suits moved in and out of the grand entrance, their movements purposeful and efficient. Charlotte felt like an intruder just standing there, her worn clothes and scuffed shoes making her painfully aware of how out of place she was. She hesitated at the entrance, her fingers trembling as they gripped the handle of the door. For a moment, she considered turning around, walking back to the bus stop, and pretending this had never happened. But then she thought of the card in her pocket, the voice that had told her she deserved a chance to start over. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The lobby was everything she had imagined and more. The marble floors gleamed under the soft light of crystal chandeliers, and the air smelled faintly of fresh flowers and expensive cologne. A sleek reception desk sat at center, staffed by a woman who looked like she had stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. Charlotte felt small, insignificant, and entirely out of her depth. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but professional. Charlotte hesitated, gripping the strap of her bag. "I'm here to see Matthew Grayson." The woman's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't comment. Instead, She nodded and motioned toward the elevators. "Take the elevator to the top floor. Mr. Grayson is expecting you." Charlotte's pulse quickened as she stepped into the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting her nervous expression back at her. The ascent felt both endless and too fast, the numbers climbing higher and higher until they reached the top. When the doors slid open, she stepped out into a space that took her breath away. Matthew's office was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. The furniture was sleek and modern, every piece carefully chosen to exude sophistication. At the far end of the room, Matthew stood by the window, his back to her, hands in his pockets. "You came," he said without turning around, his voice calm and steady. "I wasn't sure I would," Charlotte replied, taking a hesitant step forward. "This isn't exactly what I'm used to." Matthew turned to face her, his sharp features softened by a faint smile. "I can imagine," he said, motioning toward a chair near his desk. "Please sit." Charlotte hesitated before crossing the room, feeling acutely aware of her every step. She sat down, her back straight, her hands resting on her lap. "I still don't understand why you chose me," she said, her voice firm despite the nervous knot in her stomach. "Out of everyone in this city, why stop for me?" Matthew took a seat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "Because you're exactly the kind of person I was looking for." "And what does that mean?" Charlotte pressed, her skepticism evident. "It means you have a strength most people don't," Matthew replied. "You've survived things that would break others. I saw that in you, and I knew you were the right choice." Charlotte folded her arms, her gaze sharp. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," he said evenly. "And I'm not asking you to make a decision right now. I just want you to hear me out." For the next half hour, Matthew explained the details of his proposal. He spoke of his desire to build a family, of the trust funds and opportunities he had prepared for the child. He assured her of the safety measures, the medical care, the financial independence she would gain. His words were calm and measured, but Charlotte couldn't help feeling like she was being swept into something far bigger than herself. "And after the child is born," she asked finally, her voice quiet but steady, "what happens to me?" "You'll have the freedom to start over," Matthew said. "Enough money to leave this life behind for good." Charlotte stared at him, her mind racing. It sounded too good to be true, and yet it also felt like her only chance. She glanced at the view outside the window, the city stretching out beneath them like a vast, unreachable world. "I need time to think about this," she said, standing. Matthew nodded, his expression calm. "Take all the time you need," he replied, standing as well. "But whatever decision you make, know that the offer is real." As he walked her to the elevator, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change forever. She wasn't sure if it was for better or worse, but for the first time in years, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Charlotte stared at the stack of papers on Matthew's pristine desk, her fingers hovering just above the edges of the crisp white sheets. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, heavier than anything she had ever carried. This wasn't just a contract. It was a decision that would change her life forever. Matthew sat across from her, his demeanor calm and composed, as though this was just another business deal for him. His hands were folded neatly on the desk, and his eyes were steady as he watched her. "Take your time," he said, his voice measured but not unkind. "I know this isn't an easy decision." Charlotte glanced up at him, her brow furrowing. "You make it sound so simple, like signing this will magically solve everything." "It won't solve everything," Matthew replied, leaning back slightly in his chair. "But it's a step, a chance to leave the past behind and build something new." She scoffed, her fingers curling into fists. "And all I have to do is hand over a child." Matthew didn't flinch at her tone. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression softening. "This isn't about handing over anything. This is about creating something together. A life for the child. A future for you. Charlotte shook her head, her eyes scanning the neatly typed text in front of her. The terms were clear. A private apartment, top-tier medical care, and a financial package that would leave her set for life. But the reality of what was being asked of her felt impossibly complex. "What happens if I can't go through with it?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "What if I change my mind halfway through?" "You won't be trapped," Matthew assured her. "If you decide to back out, the resources provided will still be yours. No strings attached." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "Why would you agree to that? You're the one taking all the risk." "Because I don't believe in forcing people into decisions they can't live with," Matthew said simply. "This has to be your choice." His words unsettled her, though she couldn't quite explain why. There was something about his calm, unwavering demeanor that made her feel both reassured and suspicious. Was this really as straightforward as he made it seem? "You really think you can plan everything, don't you?" she said, crossing her arms. Matthew smiled faintly. "Planning is what I do best. But even I know not everything can be controlled." The vulnerability in his tone caught her off guard. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something human behind his polished exterior. She filed the thought away, unsure of what to make of it. "What's this clause about anonymity?" she asked, flipping to a page in the contract. "It's for your protection as much as mine," Matthew explained. "Your identity will remain private. No one needs to know about this arrangement." Charlotte frowned, her thumb brushing over the edge of the paper. "And the baby? You're asking me to just disappear?" Matthew's expression softened, and he paused before answering. "The child will be cared for. They'll have every opportunity, every resource. But yes, the terms require you to step away." Her chest tightened. She hadn't allowed herself to think about that part too much, but now it was staring her in the face, undeniable and unrelenting. Could she live with herself, knowing she brought life into the world only to walk away? "Do you have any idea how hard that would be?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Yes," Matthew said quietly. "I know it won't be easy. For either of us." The honesty in his voice surprised her. She had expected cold detachment, a businessman's calculated response. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, that made her hesitate. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. "You said you're doing this to secure your legacy. What does that even mean? You're already rich. You've already built your empire. What more could you possibly need?" Matthew's gaze drifted to the window, his expression pensive. "Legacy isn't just about money or power," he said after a moment. "It's about leaving something meaningful behind, a part of yourself that lives on. I've spent my life building things, but none of it feels permanent." His words hung in the air, heavy and raw. For a moment, Charlotte forgot about the contract in front of her. She saw not a millionaire with endless resources, but a man searching for something he couldn't buy. "Do you ever wonder if you're making a mistake?" she asked softly. "All the time," Matthew admitted, his voice tinged with a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "But I've spent too long letting fear dictate my choices. I'm done with that." Charlotte looked down at the contract, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. This was her chance, her one shot at escaping the cycle of poverty and survival that had defined her life for so long. But it came with a cost, one she wasn't sure she was ready to pay. "What happens to me after all this?" she asked finally. "Once the baby's born and I walk away, what's left for me?" "You'll have the freedom to start over," Matthew said, his voice steady. "To create the life you want, without the weight of the past holding you back." The simplicity of his answer struck a chord in her. For years, she had dreamed of a fresh start, a life where she wasn't defined by her circumstances. And now, here it was, laid out in black and white. "I don't even know if I can do this," she whispered. "You don't have to decide now," Matthew replied, leaning back in his chair. "Take the contract home. Read it. Think about it. When you're ready, let me know. Charlotte nodded slowly, picking up the stack of papers. The weight of them in her hands felt symbolic, a tangible representation of the decision she had to make. As Matthew walked her to the elevator, she felt the tension between them shift, no longer just two strangers bound by a proposition, but two people connected by the possibility of something neither fully understood. As the elevator doors closed, Charlotte looked down at the contract, her reflection staring back at her from the polished surface. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had a choice. Charlotte stepped cautiously into the apartment, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the space before her. It was nothing like the cramped shelters and cold alleyways she had grown accustomed to. The apartment was massive, with polished hardwood floors that gleamed under the warm light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The furniture was sleek and modern, carefully arranged to give the space an air of effortless luxury. A faint, fresh scent lingered in the air, like lavender and new beginnings. For a moment, she stood frozen in the doorway, her worn sneakers scuffing the pristine floor as she tried to take all in. It didn't feel real. The apartment was too perfect, too untouched. It felt more like a stage set than a place where someone could actually live. "It's all yours," Matthew said from behind her, his voice calm and steady. He stepped past her, setting a folder down on the marble countertop in the open-plan kitchen. Inside, you'll find everything you need. Schedules for doctor's appointments, contact numbers, and a list of services available to you. Charlotte blinked, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "This is a lot," she said, her voice trailing off as she glanced around. "Why go through all this trouble?" Matthew turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Because this isn't just about the baby," he said simply. "It's about making sure you're safe and comfortable." She frowned, her gaze darting around the room again. "You could have found someone who already had their life together. Someone who didn't need all this." "That's not what I wanted," Matthew replied, leaning against the counter. "I didn't want perfect. I wanted someone who understands what it means to fight for something." His words lingered in the air, cutting through her lingering skepticism. For a moment, Charlotte didn't know how to respond. She shifted her weight, feeling out of place in the immaculate apartment. Matthew walked to the fridge and opened it, revealing shelves stocked with fresh produce, neatly arranged containers, and bottles of water. "You'll find the kitchen fully stocked," he said, gesturing toward the fridge. "If there's anything else you need, let me know." Charlotte nodded numbly, still trying to process everything. Her life had been a constant struggle for so long that the idea of having everything handed to her felt wrong, unearned. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "There is no catch," Matthew said evenly. "You agreed to the terms, and I'm honoring them." Charlotte studied him for a moment, her brow furrowed. He seemed so calm, so sure of everything. It was unnerving. "Why are you like this?" she asked, crossing her arms. "So composed. Like none of this bothers you." Matthew hesitated, his gaze dropping for a moment before meeting hers again. "Because I've spent my entire life planning, anticipating every possible outcome. It's the only way I know how to operate." "And does it always work?" she asked, her tone tinged with sarcasm. Matthew allowed a faint smile. "Not always," he admitted. "But it helps." Charlotte sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "You really think you've got everything figured out, don't you?" "Not everything," he replied, his tone softening. "But I like to think I'm prepared for most things." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. She wasn't used to seeing cracks in his polished exterior. It made him seem more human, more real. Matthew straightened, his professional demeanor returning. "There's also a phone for you," he said, motioning toward the coffee table. "It's preloaded with all the numbers you might need, including mine. If anything comes up, call me." Charlotte nodded again, her mind still racing. As Matthew moved toward the door, she felt a pang of uncertainty. "You're leaving already?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "I think you need time to settle in," he said, pausing at the doorway. "But Charlotte," he turned to face her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "You don't have to face this alone. If you need anything, all you have to do is ask." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door clicking softly behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, Charlotte didn't move. She stared at the door, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't quite name. Finally, she set her bag down and began to explore the apartment. Every corner of it felt like a foreign world. Smooth surfaces, soft textures, and little touches of elegance that made her feel like she didn't belong. In the bedroom, she ran her fingers over the edge of the duvet, marveling at how soft it was. The closet was stocked with new clothes in her size, the tags still attached. She wandered into the bathroom, where the marble countertops gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting. A basket of neatly folded towels sat by the tub, along with an assortment of expensive-looking toiletries. Charlotte stared at her reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. "This is real," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "This is actually happening." That night, she lay in the massive bed, staring up at the ceiling as her thoughts spiraled. The weight of the day pressed down on her, along with the realization of what she had agreed to. She thought about the baby, about the months ahead, and about the man who had orchestrated all of this. For the first time in years, she felt safe. But the safety came with a strange, suffocating weight, a fear that she might wake up and find it all gone. And yet, despite the uncertainty, she allowed herself to close her eyes and drift off. The warmth of the blankets wrapped around her like a cocoon, and for the first time, in as long as she could remember, she slept without fear. Charlotte's days began to settle into a routine she never thought possible. Mornings were slow and quiet, often spent curled up on the plush couch with a steaming mug of tea. The apartment, with its endless comforts and serene atmosphere, was a far cry from the cold, chaotic streets she had left behind. But even with the steady rhythm of her new life, a part of her remained restless, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Her weekly doctor's appointments had become a strange source of comfort. The staff Matthew had arranged for her were kind and professional, their attentiveness a stark contrast to the indifferent glances she had grown used to. Every time she heard the steady, reassuring beat of the baby's heart on the monitor, a small flicker of hope stirred inside her. It was a reminder that something tangible, something real, was growing within her, a life that symbolized a fresh start. But while the baby's presence was becoming more real, her relationship with Matthew remained a puzzle. He visited sparingly, always brief and businesslike, as if careful not to overstep. Yet, every interaction left her with more questions than answers. She couldn't decide if he was a calculated businessman fulfilling a transaction or a man with deeper motives he refused to show. One afternoon, as Charlotte returned from an appointment, she was surprised to find Matthew waiting in the living room. He stood by the expansive windows, his silhouette outlined by the soft glow of the setting sun. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his impeccably tailored trousers, and his posture, while composed, carried an air of heaviness. "You don't usually visit without warning," Charlotte said, setting her bag down near the door. Her tone was light, but her curiosity was unmistakable. Matthew turned, offering her a faint smile. "I thought it was time we talked," he said, motioning to the couch. "Do you have a moment?" Charlotte raised an eyebrow, the faintest smirk tugging at her lips. "Do I look busy to you?" He chuckled softly, though the sound lacked its usual confidence. "Fair enough." As they both sat, an unusual silence filled the space. Matthew's usual composed demeanor seemed strained, and for the first time, Charlotte noticed the subtle signs of weariness in his face, the faint lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. It was as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him, and for once, he wasn't trying to hide it. "You've been quiet lately," Matthew began, his voice measured. "I wanted to make sure everything was going smoothly." Charlotte leaned back, crossing her arms. "You mean with the baby?" she asked, her tone tinged with suspicion. "Or with me?" "Both," Matthew admitted, his gaze steady. "I know this hasn't been easy for you." Charlotte let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "Easy. That's one way to put it. I don't mean to downplay what you've been through," Matthew said, his voice softening. "I know how much you've sacrificed to be here." "Do you?" she countered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you've got it all figured out." Matthew exhaled, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I wish that were true," he said quietly. "But I don't have all the answers. Far from it." His admission caught her off guard. She had always seen him as unshakable, a man who operated with precision and control. Hearing him speak with vulnerability made her reevaluate everything she thought she knew about him. "What's going on, Matthew?" she asked, her tone softening. "You don't seem like yourself." He hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," he said finally. "About what happens after the baby is born. What kind of life they'll have. What kind of father I'll be." Charlotte studied him carefully, sensing the weight behind his words. "And what's the verdict?" she asked gently. Matthew turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent my entire life building things, companies, systems, plans. But none of that feels like it matters now." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. For a moment, Charlotte saw not the powerful businessman she had grown to expect, but a man grappling with doubts and fears he rarely allowed anyone to see. "You're not used to feeling out of control, are you?" she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Matthew chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not even a little." Charlotte leaned forward, her gaze steady. "You don't have to have it all figured out, you know." "No one does." Matthew looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "I've spent so long trying to control everything," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time I stopped." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them shifted, no longer strained, but filled with a quiet understanding. Charlotte realized that, for all his wealth and power, Matthew was just as uncertain about the future as she was. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a warm, golden light, Matthew stood. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady once more. "For listening." Charlotte nodded, her expression softening. "Any time," she replied. Before he left, Matthew hesitated at the door, glancing back at her. "Charlotte," he said, his voice quieter now, "you're not as alone in this as you think." The words lingered in the air long after he was gone, filling the silence with a warmth she hadn't expected. For the first time, Charlotte felt a crack in the walls she had built around herself, a glimmer of something she couldn't quite name. As she sat alone in the quiet apartment, her thoughts drifted to the man who had turned her world upside down. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. Charlotte sat by the window in the early hours of the morning, her gaze fixed on the city skyline. The soft hum of the city waking up filled the apartment, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Matthew's recent visit had left her with more questions than answers. His vulnerability had been surprising, almost unsettling. She couldn't reconcile the man who seemed so in control with the one who admitted to feeling lost. She turned the small pendant necklace he had given her between her fingers, the diamond glinting faintly in the soft light. He had called it a safeguard, a way to ensure her safety, but it felt like more than that. It was a reminder of the strange, complicated bond they had begun to share, one that neither of them had anticipated. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was barely 7 a.m. Visitors weren't part of her routine. Setting the pendant down, she walked to the door and opened it cautiously. To her surprise, Matthew stood on the other side, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. His tie was loose, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing his usually hidden vulnerability. His face was pale, his jaw tight, as though he had been wrestling with a decision all night. "Matthew," she asked, her voice laced with concern, "is everything okay?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped inside, his presence filling the space. "I'm sorry for coming so early," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "I needed to talk to you." Charlotte motioned for him to sit, her worry growing. She had never seen him like this. "What's going on?" she asked, sitting across from him. Matthew ran a hand through his hair, his usual composure slipping. "I've been avoiding this conversation," he admitted, "but I can't anymore." Charlotte's chest tightened. "What conversation?" He looked at her, his piercing blue eyes softened by an emotion she couldn't quite place. "I've tried to keep this arrangement professional, clear-cut, but the truth is, it's not that simple for me anymore." Her heart skipped a beat as his words hung in the air. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. Matthew exhaled, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "When I first approached you, I saw this as a way to solve a problem, a business deal, nothing more. But over the past few months, you've become more than just part of an agreement." Charlotte's breath caught. She searched his face for signs of insincerity, but found none. His words were raw, unpolished, and undeniably real. "Matthew," she began, her voice faltering. She didn't know what to say, how to process what he was telling her. "I know this wasn't part of the plan," he continued, his tone steady but vulnerable. "But I can't ignore how I feel. You've changed the way I see things, the way I see myself." Charlotte stared at him, her emotions swirling. This was the man who had offered her a lifeline, who had been both a source of security and confusion. And now, he was standing in front of her, admitting that she had changed his life. "This is a lot," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I know," Matthew replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "And I'm not asking for anything from you. I just needed to be honest." Charlotte sat back, her thoughts racing. She thought about the walls she had built around herself, the years of struggling to survive. Letting someone in had always felt like a risk she couldn't afford. But Matthew was different. He had seen her at her lowest, and still treated her with respect and care. "You've been honest with me," she said after a long pause. "So I'll be honest with you. I don't know what this means. I don't know how to feel about us. But I know that I don't want to walk away from this, whatever it is." Matthew's shoulders relaxed slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "That's more than I could have hoped for," he said quietly. The tension between them softened, replaced by a tentative understanding. For the first time, they weren't just two people bound by a contract. They were something more, something undefined but undeniably real. As the morning light grew brighter, Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded envelope. He placed it on the table between them. "There's one more thing," he said. "This is for you." Charlotte frowned, picking up the envelope and unfolding it. Inside was a detailed document outlining a trust fund, not just for the baby, but for her. It included plans for her education, housing, and financial independence, far beyond what had been in their original agreement. "I don't understand," she said, looking up at him. "I wanted to make sure you have everything you need," Matthew said simply. "Not just now, but for the future." Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the depth of his commitment, not just to the child, but to her. "Matthew, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "Just promise me you'll use it. Build the life you've always deserved, Charlotte nodded, her voice too choked to respond. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. And for the first time, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could trust someone else with her future. They sat together in the quiet apartment, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, neither of them would face it alone. Charlotte's mornings had taken on a quiet rhythm, but something about this one felt wrong. The sun's light streaming through the large windows seemed colder, the air heavier. She tried to brush it off as she poured herself a cup of tea, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave her. She had grown used to the silence of the apartment, but today it felt deafening. Just as she set the kettle back on the stove, her phone rang. The unfamiliar number flashing on the screen made her hesitate. She answered cautiously, her voice tinged with curiosity and dread. "Hello," she said. "Miss Charlotte," the voice on the other end asked, formal but calm. "This is Edward Shaw. I'm Mr. Grayson's attorney." Her stomach dropped. Matthew's attorney. He had never contacted her directly before. Something was wrong. "Yes, this is Charlotte," she replied, her voice steady despite the sudden knot in her chest. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause, one long enough to make her grip the counter for support. "Mr. Grayson has been hospitalized," Edward said finally. "He asked me to contact you." The words hit her like a blow. "Hospitalized," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened?" "He experienced complications related to his heart condition," Edward explained. "He's stable, but his situation is serious." Charlotte's hand tightened on the edge of the counter. She knew about Matthew's health struggles. He had admitted them to her in moments of vulnerability. But hearing this now so suddenly made her realize just how much she had underestimated the severity of his condition. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice firmer now. "I need to see him." Edward hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to comply. "He's at St. Andrew's Hospital, in the private wing," he said. "I can make arrangements for your visit." "Thank you," Charlotte said quickly, already grabbing her coat. "I'm on my way." The cab ride to the hospital felt endless. Charlotte stared out the window, her thoughts racing. She couldn't stop picturing Matthew, his calm demeanor, his subtle smiles, the way he always seemed so in control. She had seen glimpses of his struggles, but she never imagined it could lead to this. When she arrived, Edward was waiting for her in the lobby. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his sharp features giving him an air of authority. "Miss Charlotte," he greeted her with a nod. "Thank you for coming." "Where is he?" she asked, cutting straight to the point. "This way," Edward said, leading her through a series of hallways and up a private elevator. As they walked, he explained Matthew's condition in more detail, how he had collapsed during a meeting, how the doctors had managed to stabilize him, and how his prognosis remained uncertain. Charlotte barely registered his words. Her focus was on reaching Matthew, on seeing him for herself. When they reached his room, Edward stepped aside, gesturing for her to go in alone. She pushed the door open slowly, her breath catching at the sight of him. Matthew lay in the hospital bed, pale and hooked up to various monitors. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room, a stark reminder of his fragility. He looked so different from the man she had come to know, so vulnerable, so human. His eyes fluttered open as she stepped closer, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. "You came," he said, his voice weak but steady. "Of course I came," Charlotte replied, pulling a chair close to the bed. "You didn't think I'd let you go through this alone, did you?" Matthew chuckled softly, though it quickly turned into a cough. "You've already done more for me than I deserve," he said. "Stop it," Charlotte said firmly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't get to decide what you deserve." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Charlotte reached out, her hand resting gently on his. His skin was cooler than she expected, a reminder of just how fragile he was. "I thought I had more time," Matthew said quietly, breaking the silence. "There were so many things I wanted to say." "You still have time," Charlotte said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't the end, Matthew. We'll get through this." He smiled faintly, his eyes meeting hers. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," she admitted, "but it's not impossible either." Matthew closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his strength. "Charlotte," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "if anything happens to me, promise me you'll protect the baby. Give them the life I couldn't." Charlotte's throat tightened, but she nodded. "I promise," she said softly, "but you're going to be here to raise them yourself." His eyes opened again, and for the first time, she saw tears glistening in them. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." The hours passed slowly, but neither of them seemed to notice. They talked about the future, about the baby, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Charlotte shared stories from her past, moments of vulnerability she had never shared with anyone. And Matthew, for the first time, let his guard down completely, revealing the fears and regrets he had carried alone for so long. When the nurse came in to check his vitals, Charlotte stepped into the hallway, her mind heavy with thoughts of the uncertain future. She leaned against the wall, her hand resting protectively on her growing belly. The baby moved gently, a reminder of the life, growing stronger every day. She placed her other hand over the necklace Matthew had given her, feeling its cool surface against her skin. As the nurse left, Charlotte returned to Matthew's side, her expression determined. "You're not giving up," she said firmly, her voice steady. "We're going to get through this, together." Matthew looked at her, his gaze soft but filled with gratitude. "You're stronger than you realize," he said. "And you're more stubborn than you realize," she replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, painting the room in hues of gold and crimson, Charlotte felt something she hadn't in years: hope. Not just for herself, but for the life they had created together, a life that would carry on no matter what challenges lay ahead. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, whispered conversations with doctors, and sleepless nights filled with worry. Charlotte spent every waking moment by Matthew's side, refusing to leave him alone for even a second. The hospital room, with its sterile white walls and beeping monitors, became their temporary world, a place where time seemed to stretch and contract unpredictably. Matthew's condition remained stable, but the uncertainty hung in the air like a storm cloud. Each time a doctor entered, Charlotte braced herself, fearing bad news. Yet, despite the tension, there was a quiet intimacy growing between them. They shared stories, laughter, and moments of silence that said more than words ever could. One evening, as the soft glow of the sunset filled the room, Matthew turned to her. His face was still pale, but his eyes had regained some of their usual sharpness. "You don't have to stay here every night, you know," he said, his voice tinged with both gratitude and concern. "You should be resting." Charlotte shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I've spent too many nights alone in worse places," she replied. "This is where I want to be." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're stubborn," he said finally, a faint chuckle escaping his lips. "And you're just realizing that now," she teased, the playful banter masking the heavier emotions they both felt. Matthew's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet contemplation. "Charlotte," he began, his voice softer now, "there's something I need to say." Her heart skipped a beat as she leaned forward, her hands resting on the edge of his bed. "What is it?" He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "I never expected any of this," he admitted. "When I approached you, it was supposed to be simple, a business arrangement. But you've become so much more than that to me." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She had felt the shift between them, the unspoken connection growing stronger with each passing day. But hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. "Matthew," she began, her voice faltering. "I know this wasn't part of the plan," he continued, cutting her off gently. "And I don't expect anything from you. But I need you to know how much you mean to me. You've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to explain." Tears welled in her eyes as she absorbed his words. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, unwanted, and now this man, the man who had turned her world upside down, was telling her that she mattered, more than she ever thought possible. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything," Matthew replied, his hand reaching for hers. "I just needed you to know." For a long moment, they sat in silence, their hands intertwined. The weight of his confession settled between them, not heavy or uncomfortable, but warm and grounding. As the evening turned into night, the doctors came in to check on Matthew. Charlotte stepped out into the hallway, giving them space to work. She leaned against the wall, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The baby kicked softly, a gentle reminder of the life growing inside her. Her thoughts swirled as she replayed Matthew's words in her mind. She had spent so long guarding her heart, convinced that letting anyone in would only lead to pain. But Matthew was different. He had seen her at her lowest and still treated her with kindness and respect. He had given her a chance to rebuild her life, and now he was offering her something she never thought she would have again: love. When she returned to the room, the doctors had finished their rounds. Matthew looked up as she entered, his eyes lighting up in a way that made her heart ache. She sat down beside him, her hand resting on the edge of the bed. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her gaze fixed on their intertwined hands, "about everything you said." Matthew didn't interrupt, waiting patiently for her to continue. "I don't know what the future holds," she admitted, "but I do know that I don't want to face it without you." His grip on her hand tightened slightly, a faint smile spreading across his lips. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, his tone teasing. "I'm not exactly an easy man to deal with." Charlotte chuckled, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "Neither am I," she said. "But maybe that's why we work." Matthew's smile grew, and for the first time in days, the tension in his face seemed to ease. "You have no idea how much that means to me," he said quietly. As the night wore on, they talked about the future, not just the baby's future, but their own. They discussed their fears, their hopes, and the life they wanted to build together. It was a conversation filled with uncertainty, but it was also filled with hope. By the time the first rays of dawn began to filter through the window, Charlotte felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wouldn't be walking it alone. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.